Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hi everyone, Happy New Year. Nothing like seeing in the year watching Rick Astley in concert. And then the fireworks of the London Eye. Oh my gosh, absolutely spectacular. Well, last year was a doozy. There were lots of ups and downs, more downs towards the end of the year, I have to say, due to family health issues, etc. But here we are in the new year, and I'm full of hope for the year to come. I thought I'd kick off the new year with one of my favorite men, Sir John Soane. Look, I'm a massive Soane fan. I'll state that at the start. I've been to his house in Lincoln Inn Fields so many times, I actually feel like an old friend turning up for a cup of tea and a chat. And you know, I actually think we would have got along just fine. So for those of you unfamiliar with Soane, he was an English architect, one of the best, who specialized in the neoclassical style. The son of a bricklayer, an exceptional bricklayer, a master bricklayer, he rose to the top of his profession, becoming Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy and an official architect to the Office of Works. He received a knighthood in 1831, and I would say that had his father been alive at that stage, he would have been incredibly proud. In 1792, Soane bought a house at 12 Lincoln's Inn Fields in London, later purchasing number 13 and number 14. And he then joined the three of them together, forming one great house. And this is now the Sir John Soane's Museum, and it's open to the public for free. And I would encourage everyone to go and visit at least once in a lifetime. I'm back in the UK once or twice a year, at this stage twice a year. And I make a point of going every time I'm there, because every time I'm there, I see something completely new. And one of the things that I love about the Soane's Museum is that later in life, John Soane developed an imaginary friend who was a Franciscan friar. And Sir John, being Sir John, I guess, completely renovated the basement of the three houses. So joined them all together, renovated the basement, joined them all up to make it one kind of huge cavernous space that he actually created, where he created a Franciscan friary. Isn't that amazing? An amazing imaginary friend. And what a benefactor to have, who will create your own friary for you in the basement of your house. So it's definitely worth a visit. Lincoln's Inn Fields is such a strange name, isn't it? And it's actually the largest public square in London. Quite amazing. Stunningly beautiful, by the way, in winter or summer. Quite the park to go to. And it was actually laid out in the 1630s under the initiative of the speculative builder and contractor William Newton, who had quite the reputation. And he was actually the first in a long series of entrepreneurs who actually took a hand in developing London as we know it today. He's got quite the interesting story just by himself. The actual original plan for laying out and planting these fields was actually drawn by no other than Inigo Jones. How incredible is that? The grounds, which had remained private property, were actually acquired by the London County Council in about 1895, but up until then they were privately owned. And they were opened to the public by its chairman, Sir John Hutton, the very same year. The oldest house in the square is Lindsay House, designed by Inigo Jones in 1640. Imagine that. Number 66 was actually built for Lord Powis, and the charter of the Bank of England was actually sealed there in 1694. Christopher Wren actually modified Powis House in 1684, and there was originally a theatre there as well in the early days called Duke's, and behind it was one of the first tennis courts in the land. It's an amazing place. It's an amazingly historical place. Lincoln Inn Fields was also the site in 1683 of the public beheading of Lord William Russell, who was son of the first Duke of Bedford, following his implication in the Rye House plot, which was basically the attempted assassination of King Charles II. The executioner was I guess he would call the Cockney boy, called Jack Ketch. And he made such a poor job of it that it actually took 4 axe blows before Lord William Russell's head fell from his body. And get this, after the first stroke on the neck with the axe, Russell actually looked up at him and said to him, "You dog, did I give you 10 guineas to use me so inhumanely?" I mean, can you imagine? Oh boy. As I said earlier, I've been there. I've been to the museum many, many, many times, and I always make a point of visiting the Soane Museum every time I'm in London. As I said, I always find something new that actually excites me and ignites me. And the last time I was there, they'd opened the dining room for the first time in the basement, and that little room led to my imagination running wild. And I actually wrote a potential treatment for a TV show after visiting. So we'll see where that goes. And of course, that idea was fostered because I was in the John Soane's museum. Soane himself was actually a world-class collector. And, oh goodness, I mean, the house is full of some of the most amazing things that actually ignite you, they crackle you, like a small fire just starting, in your imagination. And I think that was actually part of John's allure. That being the case, instead of actually telling you about the house, which I could talk about for hours, I thought that I would take you on a visit to Bentley Priory, best known as the Royal Air Force's headquarters during the Battle of Britain. A battle that my dad flew in and fought in. He was actually flying Spitfires at the time. However, Bentley Priory's history long predates that, and in that history is Sir John Soane, who in 1788 was commissioned by the Priory's then owner to extend and refurbish the house in a more lavish and sumptuous manner. It's quite something. It's probably one of my favorite houses in all of Britain. Of course, Soane did much more than just the Priory, but I wanted to start there because it was one of his earlier projects and one of his more personal projects. Of course, this month actually sees the 187th anniversary of Soane's death, and it's one of the reasons why I visited the Priory, so I can actually tell you a little bit more about his work, but also about the man himself. So stay with me, and I'll enlighten you just a little, and hopefully take you on a journey around one of my favorite buildings in England. So who was he? Well, as I mentioned, he was the son of a bricklayer and had 3 siblings. John was the youngest. He was born in 1753, which actually seems like a long time ago now, but it really wasn't. And his father, as I mentioned, wasn't just a bricklayer. He was a master bricklayer, and he had pretty good mates, architects and the like, and he used his professional contacts to help his son. John Soane actually studied in Reading. He went to school in Reading, and then he moved and worked for quite a character, a guy called George Dance the Younger, who was also a connection of his father, and that brought him at the age of 15 into architectural work for the first time. But part of the reason is because I don't know if anyone listening has actually seen any of John Soane's drawings, but oh my God, he had an incredible talent. And that raw talent, his dad recognized it, but with his dad's knowledge and John Soane growing up in that building environment, because his dad was a bricklayer, meant that there was really only one pathway for this talented boy to follow. From 1771, age 19, he studied at the RA, or the Royal Academy of Arts, which managed to not just draw out his talent, but his natural ability for architecture. And it actually became an obsession with him. He loved books, he was a voracious reader, and that's one of the reasons that we now have the Soane's Library, which is actually held within the John Soane's Museum. Worth a visit, to be honest with you, just for that alone. He also won the Gold Medal for Architecture in 1776, which was for his Triumphal Bridge, which was an amazing project, and he was then awarded a travel scholarship, which if you were an architect of the day and you wanted to learn about the greats from around the world, all the wonderful things about architecture from the Greeks and the Romans, you absolutely had to go traveling. However, in order to do that, you had to have money behind you, and he had none. I mean, effectively, he had 3 siblings, and his father was a bricklayer, so there wasn't any money to spare, certainly not for ventures like this. But, and this always makes me smile because it's one of these serendipitous things that just happens. As fate turns and dances, kind of in your favor, he also won the traveling scholarship bursary. I mean, seriously, which allowed him to go off and actually do that for 2 to 3 years. So he did. And along the way, he met some amazing people, saw some fabulous buildings, and started to understand the concepts of classicism. The Grand Tour, it's actually really important to emphasize how vital this was for an architect to do at this particular time. The Grand Tour was a prevalent cultural and educational pursuit pretty much of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, probably actually the 17th and 18th centuries. And it was embraced by young, upper-class European men. And this practice actually involved extensive, long journeys through major cities and the cultural hubs in continental Europe because they served as a crucial aspect for their education and for cultural refinement. So it was primarily an educational venture. And the Grand Tour actually exposed the men who went on it to art, to literature, to architecture, and to the classical heritage of Europe. Traveling through cities such as Paris and Rome and Florence and Venice. Can you imagine? It would have provided a completely diverse cultural experience, broadening perspectives and fostering, I think it would have fostered an appreciation for Europe's rich history and artistic achievements, especially of the European civilization. And you would never have had that had you just stayed in Great Britain. I think also beyond its educational role, the Grand Tour also functioned as an incredible social networking platform. Participants like John engaged with fellow members of the European elite, which basically then fostered, discussions on intellectual ideas. It formed alliances that you could never have got from staying at home, and it reinforced your social status. All of this was incredibly important. Undertaking the Grand Tour actually became a symbol of status in many ways, showcasing not only an individual's wealth, and certainly not in John's case, but showcasing his education and his cultural sophistication. And I think that was the importance, or the important part for him. And it was commonly viewed as a rite of passage for privileged young men. Overall, the Grand Tour played a pivotal role in shaping the cultural, intellectual, and social development of European elites, and John was well and truly one of those. It facilitated the exchange of knowledge, ideas, and cultural influences across various European regions. Full stop. So Soane was actually accompanied by Robert Bettingham. He was later to become quite a famous architect as well. And they embarked on the Grand Tour together, reaching Rome in 1778. At the time, they would have visited significant landmarks such as the Palace of Versailles and the Temple of Vesta. And Soane's architectural endeavors and connections with influential figures like the Earl of Bristol, they underscore the tour's significance. Soane's travels also extended to Naples, where he encountered, future clients, and more importantly, explored sites like Pompeii. This Grand Tour actually continued to be a transformative experience, influencing not only Soane's language proficiency, but also inspiring future architectural designs. This journey also included visits to Sicily and to Palermo, and these 2 places left a lasting impression on him. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa, but they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penang myhome.com. And we are back. So Soane traveled extensively. He went to Sicily. He visited Palermo. He went to Lombardy. He, as I've mentioned, went to places like Milan and Verona and Venice, to continue his architectural, knowledge, building this incredible base. And he met with influential figures like, Henry Banks and the Earl of Bristol, who eventually became clients of his. This was how important this grand tour was. So Soane actually concluded his grand tour in 1780, returning to England with this incredible newfound knowledge and with lifelong friendships of people that he'd met along the way. And I think the grand tour actually remained a transformative and I think essential chapter in Soane's life. It's that pathway that he took that was less walked that changed his life. But he was now employed by Henry Holland. Actually, he was employed with Henry Holland just before he went on the grand tour. And then when he came back, he took up his position there again. And this is the amazing thing. Henry Holland was quite famous at this stage by himself, and he also worked with Capability Brown. And I did a podcast about Capability Brown in December, I think. So if you want to learn more about Capability Brown, please click in to listen to that, because that's worthwhile hearing about just on its own. And what an amazingly wonderful association. I mean, who wouldn't have wanted to work with, or even just to know, Capability Brown, and to possibly work with him on various projects? So at this stage, as a young man, he'd worked with George Dance and Henry Holland, and by association, Capability Brown. And these three great men took him under their wing. I mean, what an internship. And these men all used trickery in their designs, which was actually part of their designing magic. And a really good example of that would be Althorpe House. Again, if you haven't gone to Althorpe House, please visit when you're in the UK. And the actual facade of the house, they actually refaced the facade to make it look like brick. And from a distance, that's what you think it is. Actually, even from close up, from about 10 to 15 feet, you think it's brick, but it's actually not. It's all mathematically designed tiles made to look like brick. And that's what I mean by using their magic to do these incredible things. And this was a first. This was the first time that these methods were being tested, and John Soane was learning from the best. And talking about meeting people, one of the people that he crossed paths with was George Wyatt, who was a surveyor for the City of London. And his niece was actually rather delightful. And she actually kept house for George, and she looked after him and everything. And Soane actually fell instantly in love with her, and they married in 1784 when he was aged 31. And they'd only met that year, in the early part of that year, and they married in August. And it was through her uncle that they managed to afford all the properties that they eventually had, because when he died, he left her everything. He left everything to his niece. And of course, by association, John's married to the niece, and that allowed, John Soane the money and the means to not only become independently wealthy, but to start his own company and do his own work. And of course, the period that we're talking about, Soane's architectural period, is from King George II all the way through to William IV, which was known as the Georgian and the Regency periods. And that's a very, if not the most important part of British architectural history. So he was around at exactly the right time. The question that I also had while doing this research were, who were his contemporaries, and did any of them become as established as he did? I was just interested. And his contemporaries were, and I think from here we have to look at his club as the actual architects club, because this was actually set up during his lifetime, and it was set up by George Dance, and members included Henry Holland, also very famous, and Robert Adam, James Wyatt, John Nash, who else? Robert Smirke, and Sir William Chambers. And these guys would actually meet. Once you became a member of the club, you were said to be on your way. You were an architect of the day, and these guys would meet once a month. And can you imagine the discussions that took place, the brainstorming that would take place at those lunches? And really interestingly, all their work actually survives today and is actually synonymous with British architecture. You know, Philip York was another member of the club. And if you were an architect, this had to be the best possible networking club in the land. And what better way to do it over a drink and a good meal? And Soane, of course, was involved in all of the above. Early in the 19th century, he also became a professor of architecture at the RA as well. So he kept up those ties with the younger architects that were coming through. And he absolutely loved it. He lived and breathed architecture. And of course, all of the members of the club were involved in neoclassicism and neo-Gothicism. And in some way, shape, or form, they all understood space and had an awareness of detail and human relations with that particular space. And I think that's really important to note because Soane was an absolute master of space and light. One of the things that I mentioned earlier was that he absolutely loved reading books, and especially architectural books. And through that, he learned a great deal about French architecture and the relationship between buildings and landscapes and geometry and their planning, the French architects, I mean, and their laying out of these amazing wonderful estates and chateaus. And this is also where you can start to see Soane's kind of work, his own work coming through, you know, the overlay of all these different concepts and ideas. And keep in mind that I mentioned earlier that he was working also with Capability Brown. So, you know, probably England's best ever landscape artist. And Capability, just to very quickly talk about him, keep in mind that Capability's work wouldn't come to fruition probably for 100 to 200 years after the design had actually been made. And that was the magic of guys like that. They could sell you the concept, they could sell you the smoke and the mirrors, but you wouldn't actually be alive to see the finished product. And I find that absolutely fascinating. So yes, John Soane was just as magical and just as fascinating as all of these contemporaries that were coming through. So he'd married and he had a family. And sadly, his sons were not nice boys by any standard. His son George was such a cad and also went to prison as a debtor. He also physically abused his wife. And I mean, he was just generally a very bad egg. Both the sons were. He was also slanderous, you know, of his father's work. And it said that, you know, his mother, John Soane's wife, after reading an account of it in the paper in 1815, so horrendous was this account that she actually collapsed and died of heart failure immediately after reading the article. But, and this is really important, this is why we have the Soane Museum today, because he purposely didn't leave it to his sons. It was left to the public. And that's why we have this world-class, it's an outstanding museum. And we get to go there for free, and we get to read and understand and experience his extensive library and collection. And the Soane Museum archives, they're not just his work. There's also a lot of work there by Smirke and Adam, drawings and the like, hand drawings. And you can see all this there. And it's actually a wonderfully, it's a hard museum to put into words. It really is, because it's so close to my heart, but it's a wonderful place to go. It's a wonderful place to go at any time of the year. Through that museum, you can also see some of the most incredible work of Joseph Michael Gandy, the amazing sketcher and watercolorist. And he actually worked hand in hand with Soane and translated a lot of Soane's impressions, you know, of his buildings to paper on his behalf. And that actually brings me back to the Bank of England, which was sadly demolished in the 1920s. I mean, it should never have been allowed, and it wouldn't be allowed to have been demolished in this particular day and age. But that was also important because it also kicked off the conservation movement. And this is what started all of that. In actual fact, it was Euston Arch that really kicked off the conservation movement. And that's a really interesting story by itself. But the Bank of England was another one that caused, when they knocked it down, that caused an awful lot of controversy. So there were things happening. There's things that happened in John Soane's life later that actually changed history as we know it today, and actually conserved a lot of the buildings that we still see in London because of Euston Arch and because of the demolition of the Bank of England. So for Soane, just to finish on the Bank of England, I mean, that's another story in its entirety. He actually worked on it in stages from 1788 all the way through to 1833. That's a long time. And he started that project, and he was still involved in that project as the building morphed and changed and was finally completed. So at the beginning of this podcast, I've kind of got off the subject a little. I was talking about Bentley Priory. And I need to take you back to Bentley Priory, if I may, because it's a building that featured quite early on in his career. He was actually involved in it from his own practice and when he came back from his grand tour. So again, he had all these ideas brimming in his head just after coming back from Europe, from spending 2 to 3 years in Europe. So it would probably have been around 1778. And part of the way that this commission came about were through people that he met on that grand tour. And then those connections, specifically Philip York, someone that he met, traveling on the grand tour, through that he went on to work not only on Bentley Priory, but also Wimpole Hall. And from there, that then opened other connections as well. So you have the Jubilee and you have Abercorn, coming through. And Soane did 3 different phases of Bentley Priory. So effectively, he would do one phase. They would then rebuild and include that, and then he would come back and work on it again, and then come back and work on it again and again. So his engagement there was something that he returned to at 3 different points in his life to work on. And that's actually important because he was learning all the time. So the dates that he was there, or the dates that he was there during those 3 times, were from 1778 through to 1798, during that 20-year period. So while not obviously being continually there, he was involved and he was aware of what was being done at the Priory, and he would have been sent the drawings, the regional drawings, all the time. And in fact, the regional drawings for that are actually in the Soane Museum if you want to go and visit. And here's the thing, you should check out the Soane website, because every now and again they open up the drawing room for a nighttime visit, usually from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. and then 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., where you can actually have a glass of wine and you can chat to the current Sir John Soane Museum architect and about some of his drawings. And it's quite something to do if you're ever in London. And I think what's interesting about Bentley Priory is that you see the changes in the plans in the Soane Museum, and what he has are these amazingly grand plans that never actually take place, largely due to money. The owners of the Priory didn't have the money. And, the changes would actually be the owner saying, well, that's absolutely wonderful, but I just can't afford it. And Soane would have to then redesign, in a simpler way. Or the owner would say, look, I'd love to, but I can't do it all in one go. And so Bentley Priory actually starts to morph and change during Soane's period based on the owner and the money that they had available to them at that stage. The first phase, which I absolutely love, gives us the rotunda and the staircase and the dowding room. And these were actually fascinating additions for Soane. And what Soane was actually notorious for was playing with classicism. So he was extremely inventive, which is just one of the reasons why I love his work. And this inventiveness we see in some of his country estates that he worked on. They then get threaded through to his more commercial work, work that he did at the Royal Hospital, the Dulwich Picture Gallery, which is astoundingly beautiful in design, which was actually built between 1811 and 1817. And just as I guess a bit of additional information, the Dulwich Picture Gallery was the first gallery that was ever built in the United Kingdom just to showcase pictures. And John Soane was the designer of that. So what we see in Bentley, which is why I'm so taken with it, is that top lit idea with the rotunda, which had never been done before. The idea of getting light in through the top, beautiful light that would actually allow for, say, the owner painting on a rainy day, or for showcasing paintings hanging on the wall. This was the first time it had ever been done. It'd never been done before. And the Soane yellow, there's actually a yellow called Soane yellow that's on the walls, is an incredibly rich mustardy yellow. It's absolutely gorgeous. And it's so deep and it's so rich, it actually pulls you in, when you walk into or walk underneath the rotunda. Soane was brilliant at that. And even his ceilings with the fine lines, oh my God, they're absolutely stunning. And this was revolutionary work because what it did was light things that couldn't be lit before that the families wanted to display. So keep in mind, folks, this is before gas. This is before electricity. So this is revolutionary in that sense, that it brought light into your house, especially during the summer months, that you would never have had before. And there are some absolutely wonderful details in this building. And Soane was actually a stickler for details. It's always about the details, isn't it? The devil is in the detail. And that saying is so true for Soane. And this is also, and one of my favorite cornice details, and I know that's a silly thing to focus on, but cornicing is actually incredibly important for a room because it's one of the things that you notice as soon as you walk in. And one of my favorite cornice details is the one in the doubting room, which is a very fine egg and dart detail. And if you don't know what that is, it's a decorative molding which consists of a series of like bas relief egg-shaped figures, alternating with dart-shaped, anchor-shaped, or tongue-shaped figures. And that joins through not only from the doubting room, but it joins through to the library and then also into the breakfast room. And you can walk from room to room to room just following it. And it's absolutely stunning. The final phase, and I know I sound like such a nerd. I'm so sorry, but it's very easy to get excited about architectural work, and especially Soane's work. So the final phase with Soane and the Bentley Priory is the entrance hall, or the porte cochere, which is an entrance large enough that a car can actually pass through. And there's actually a wonderful drawing by Gandhi of the external and internal ideas and impressions and aspirations, from Soane of what it's going to be in the Soane Museum. And what comes through is the color and the warmth. It really explodes through into these rooms, and it's quite extraordinary. And as I said to you before, Soane was an absolute master of light and using bits of color that you wouldn't ordinarily see. What the museum also has in its archives from Ireland, from the Abercorn family, is the original schedule of work from Crace. And Crace was the interior decorator, I mean, effectively the painter for Bentley Priory, who not only worked on Bentley, but he worked on an entire list of buildings with Soane. Well, he was a master at creating lists of paint for doors and walls. And from that list, we actually know that there was an amazing cloud ceiling in the anteroom of Bentley Priory, which is now actually the operations room because of the RAF takeover during the Second World War. But it used to be the anteroom. It's now the operations room. And when the RAF, just after the RAF moved out after the Second World War, they painted over Soane's original ceiling. And it would have been, his ceiling would have actually been voluptuous. It would have been voluptuous clouds and that beautiful roundedness and blues and, colors that only Soane would have used. And unfortunately, they painted over it with a Battle of Britain scene, which is fantastic by itself, but it wasn't the original Soane painting. And what they've done since that is take it back to the original Soane idea, and they've repainted over it again with this amazing cloud scene. I actually love that they did that. I think Soane would have been pleased. Even though it's not his original ceiling, I think it's a very good likeness to something that he would have been part of. Look, I'm drawn to Soane partly because of the history of when he was alive and the changes that were taking place in London. I also like I'm interested in the fact by his really kind of horrible family circumstances. You think about his sons, but his genius survives in places like Bentley because he was inventive. The museum stands because his sons were so horrible. Soane used light like no other architect of the time. And that's one of the reasons why his buildings still survive today and some of his interiors still survive today. But for me, it's the absolute scale of what he did and the detail that goes into that scale. And some of his buildings are absolutely huge, huge. And the idea of space that Soane had, of space being a wonderfully expansive, thing, but where he was actually bring it down to human interaction and human scale, and the individual detailing of it, that's what really touches me about Soane and his architecture. You can actually have a direct association with him. I talked about the mustardy yellow walls, under in the rotunda of Bentley Hall. These are things that you can actually touch and know that he's been a part of. And that's actually very special. Some architects are actually too egotistical to allow you to do that. And Soane wasn't that man. And, whilst he was actually seen as being a very, very different and probably too inventive an architect for his time, in the 20th century, we're still learning from his work, and we're still learning to appreciate what he did today. We're still learning how to use the techniques that he invented today. And you just have to look at his picture gallery and the galleries actually within his house to see how those ideas have carried through. It's fascinating. And of course, that brings us back around to Bentley and how that's going to be seen in the future. And I think it's one of those properties that will sustain the test of time. And I think even 100 years from now, we'll still be learning from it. If you were to visit Bentley Priory tomorrow, after listening to this podcast, the one feature that you really want to look at that will allow you to experience Soane the man is that corridor that I spoke of and the porte cochere, which leads into the filter room, with the incredible top lights, with the cupolas, with the niches. It's just exquisite. It's a small area. It's not a big area, but if you stand in the middle of that, in the middle of the rotunda, and just look up, you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see what he did. And it's not on a grand scale, but it's on a human scale. It's absolutely my most favorite area. Just thinking about the museum, the museum itself in Lincoln Inn Fields, I think what's great about it, and I think what's fantastic about the team that actually run the museum, is that the other stories that they're actually pulling through, that they're pulling together, the threads of that they are pulling through to make every visit to that museum completely different. And as I said to you, that's what makes that museum my absolute favorite museum in the entire world. It's always different. You'll always see something new. It's that special. Folks, thanks for listening in. I'm glad to kick off the year with a little bit of a talk about John Soane. Hopefully you have a better appreciation of the man himself if you haven't heard of him. And please go and visit the museum. Please. You won't be sorry that you did, and I think you'll be happy that you took me up on that advice. It's a pleasure to actually bring this to you as the first podcast, and I'll look forward to chatting to you throughout the year, no matter where that journey takes me. So thanks again, folks, and speak to you next week. Bye for now.